A few weeks ago, Lucas Klein interviewed me um, on Marxism, among other things. Um, I want today to clarify uh, my own position vis-a-vis Marxism. I did not make it very clear, and I think I even misrepresented myself in that interview. Um, I think I often have not clearly communicated my position in this area because for me, Marxism is a sociological theory. I was originally trained as a sociologist. Durkheim, Weber, Marx, these are among the great sociological thinkers. And so for me, Marxism is a sociological perspective. It's a form of sociological analysis. But I realize that in today's world, many people, not just Jordan Peterson, but when they hear the term Marxism, they immediately think of Marxism-Leninism, which is not at all the same thing as Marxism. Uh, In my university days as a graduate student, um, I joined the Trotskyist movement for a time. I considered myself a communist, but the Trotsky that I was identifying with was the early Trotsky who was a Menshevik, not a Bolshevik. In fact, during his early years as a Menshevik, uh, Trotsky delivered a very penetrating critique of Bolshevism, uh, specifically of Leninism. Now, unfortunately, he seemed to have dropped that critique. He later joined Lenin, became a Marxist-Leninist, uh, but, well, what was his critique? I mean, along very similar lines as the anarchist critique of Marxism Leninism. By the anarchist critique, I mean writers such as Bakunin. Uh, Trotsky essentially argued that the trouble with Leninism is that the people, the proletariat, comes to be represented by the party, and then over time, the party comes to be represented by the Central Committee, and over time, the Central Committee comes to be represented by the leader. Um, Trotsky diagnosed the coming of Stalinism. Uh, by the time he actually saw that, it was too late, but he had predicted this earlier in his life, um, before he joined the Leninists. Um, Myself, I quickly became aware of the essentially undemocratic and manipulative character of the Trotskyism of that time. Um, there would be a meeting of the University of Toronto Committee to End the War in Vietnam, but hours before that, the Trotskyists would be holding a meeting planning how they would manipulate and take over um, the students' meeting later on. Highly manipulative. Um, I lost interest very quickly. I I abandoned Marxism, Leninism, and Bolshevik Trotskyism, I abandoned that and I essentially turned to anarchism. I was reading Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Noam Chomsky. And that was my outlook, but I still considered myself a Marxist because in my mind, Marxism is not Marxism-Leninism. Marxism is a sociological theory, a type of sociological analysis. And I have recently had a paper accepted for publication which contains a piece of such Marxist analysis. I observed that the loss of interest in psychoanalysis, that is, within psychoanalysis, there was a loss of interest in the Freudian theory of guilt and of guilt substitutes and of guilt evasion. There was a loss of interest in moral masochism, self-punishment, self-defeat. To me, these are the golden insights of Freudian theory. And frankly, the Freudian theory of the superego, guilt, self-punishment, is at the core of most psychopathology, even psychosis, where the hostile superego is projected out and then appears to be coming back at us from the outside. Persecutors of various types. And certainly in neurosis, unconscious guilt and self-punishment. Of course, the patient is not feeling guilty. Of course not. It's unconscious guilt. But the patient is punishing himself, sabotaging himself, wrecking himself in various ways, including psychosomatic forms of illness and hysterical suffering, the theater of the body, bodily punishment, punishment of the body, pain in the body, or pain in one's relationships, pain in the marriage, masochism. Anyway, psychoanalysis in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and carrying on has pretty much turned away from these golden Freudian insights into human suffering. Why? Well, because the economy was turning away from regulation and regulators. It was calling for deregulation, privatization. As psychoanalysis was turning away from the superego, so neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism was turning away from regulation and regulators. And psychoanalysis was following suit. Okay, this is Marxist analysis, the ideological superstructure, religion, education, including psychoanalytic theory, is a reflection of the underlying socioeconomic substructure. I'm not a total determinist. I think that while the substructure can generate ideas, ideas can also influence the substructure to some degree. But while not entirely determining the superstructure, certainly insight into changes in the superstructure can be had by looking at the socioeconomic substructure, which I think in the last analysis is the underlying determining force. Okay, this is Marxist analysis. This has nothing whatever to do with Marxism-Leninism. It has nothing whatever to do with Maoism. It has nothing to do whatever to do with Castroism. I'm not interested in these movements because I think what really turned me against revolutionary politics was the great biography of Trotsky written by Isaac Deutscher in 3 volumes, The Prophet Armed, The Prophet Disarmed, and The Prophet Betrayed. Okay, this is a great work of English literature, actually, one of the great biographies of all time. And of course, Deutscher had been a Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, but you can see as the story unfolds, you can see Deutscher's disillusionment, not just with Trotskyism, not just with Trotsky, the man, but with revolutionary politics, because Deutscher sees, and other writers have helped me to see, that in order to make a revolution, one has to enter into what in psychoanalytic theory, Kleinian theory, is the paranoid schizoid position. One has to harden one's heart. One has to pick up guns. One has to fight. And there is a self-blinding, a self-blinkering. I mean, someone in the depressive reparative position cannot pull a trigger. We know that many of the soldiers never could pull the trigger. Okay, to do that, to kill, one has to move into the paranoid schizoid position, blind oneself essentially to one's conscience, convince oneself that what one is doing, although it looks evil, is in fact for the greater good. Um, Now, I'm not at all saying this is never necessary. Hitler had to be put down. Hitler had to be killed. Um, and so we need people who are capable of killing. We need people who are capable of entering into the paranoid schizoid position. Uh, but I'm not denying this. But all I'm saying is that I'm very skeptical of revolutionaries who think that they can enter the paranoid schizoid position, do the killing that is necessary to overthrow the old regime, and then suddenly become Democrats. Suddenly re-enter the depressive reparative position now that they have seized power, and now are able to rule democratically, conscientiously, respecting minority rights and freedoms and so on. I don't think it happens that way. I think that once a person becomes a killer and justifies killing, I don't know that that person can recover really very well from that. Uh, and now that they have power, suddenly become benevolent and democratic. Uh, in order to make a revolution, you have to become authoritarian. You think after the revolution, when you have power, you're going to stop being authoritarian, especially when there are various attempts at counter-revolution that have to be fought off? No. The idea of temporary authoritarianism, I'm very skeptical of that. Okay, so that's my stance. It's not a revolutionary stance, it's a democratic stance. Um, I'm a critic of capitalism, especially neoliberal capitalism. I'm not against small business. We should live in a free society where people are able to make a business and turn a profit and earn a living. What I'm really against is corporate capitalism, which might just as well be called corporate socialism, socialism for the rich, but not for the poor. The billionaires rarely pay taxes while the rest of us do. I'm talking about the kind of corruption that goes on between corporations and governments. This is the kind of corporate capitalism that I detest. But my politics are Menshevik. social democratic, democracy and anti-authoritarianism is my central value. Um, in psychoanalysis, I oppose the superego because it's authoritarian. And I do not oppose the conscience because the conscience is loving and forgiving. It calls us to account for wrongdoing, but it doesn't whip us. It calls us to come back on the proper moral path. Okay, the superego is a torturer. It's a tyrant. And like all tyrants, and like all authoritarians, whether they be authoritarians on the right or authoritarians on what I think of as the pseudo-left, I'm talking about the social justice warriors and the cancel culture, that's authoritarianism. So I came up with this neat little phrase, let the woke who are not authoritarian call out the woke who are. Let the woke who are not authoritarian call out the woke who are. In my view, the central problem is authoritarianism. Okay, I hope I've clarified my views in this area.